Vision. The Religions of Man, with Dr. Houston Smith, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Washington University.
Tonight we're going to be talking about China. And this is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult because everybody's talking about China today. The newspapers, the politicians, and our minds are so full of the way they're talking about China that it's going to be very difficult to think about China in a very different way. When the roof of a house is burning, it's hard to take thought of the foundation. When the buds of a tree are being nipped by a late freeze, it is difficult to think about the roots. When our minds are so full of Mao Zedong, it's hard to think about Confucius. And when our thoughts are so full of Pei Moi and Matsu, it's difficult to think about such things as filial piety and the code of the gentleman. And yet we do know that the roof rests ultimately upon the house's foundation. And the buds draw their vitality and their life itself from the roots. It's no different here. The things that are happening in China today are related to the roots of Chinese civilization. But with only one evening to spend on Confucianism, we're not going to be able to spell out too much of this relationship. We're going, unfortunately, to have to stick pretty close to the roots themselves, leaving it to you or to another occasion to spell out the connection between the two. Confucianism, like Buddhism, begins with a man, of course, whom we call Confucius. He was born in the 6th century BC, that fabulous century in religious history which gave birth to Buddha in India, in which Zoroaster probably lived in Persia, in which some of the greatest prophets of Israel lived in Palestine, and some of the greatest thinkers like Pythagoras in Greece. Confucius' life wasn't particularly interesting. His father was a minor government official. He had a very good education. He held a few minor posts in his late teens, and in his 20s he established himself as a teacher where he distinguished himself. He is said to have attracted 3,000 students, which without means of mass communication, television, radio, and the like, was quite a feat for his day. At 50, he came to the conclusion that in order for his principles to really take hold, he and his disciples would have to get into administration. The scholars are divided as to whether he actually did achieve a high government post, but we do know that from the age of 55, for about 12 years, he entered upon the so-called long trek where he went from state to state offering his advice to the rulers as to how they should govern. Then in the closing years of his life, he returned to his own native province of Lu, where he spent the remainder of his life in quiet and happiness and editing the classics. Throughout his life, he impressed his followers as a man with a keen mind, a strong will, a man of deep sincerity and humility, a man with a fervent sense of responsibility and a desire for reality rather than display. And yet, if we want the secret of Confucius, we're going to have to go beyond his life. We're going to have to look to the teachings for his life, good though it was, exemplary even, was not dramatic enough to account for the major following which he made, the impact he made upon his society. So, if we want his influence, we must turn, as I say, beyond the man to the teachings of the man. Now, when we do this, I must warn you at the start that he was so concerned with the problem of man's relation to his fellow man and so little concerned with the problem of man's relation to God that his teachings sound often more like an ethics than like a religion. This doesn't really do him justice. We know that he was a religious man. He prayed. He believed in heaven, probably a very personal force, a being in which he was in intimate communion. We know also that in the close of his life, he said that if he had another 50 years to live, he would like to give that time to the I Ching, which dealt with cosmology rather than human affairs. But the fact remains that he was so beset with such an acute social problem that this commanded all his attention. Someone once asked him, "Tell us about death." And he said, "A child, before it learns to run, must first learn to walk. We do not yet understand the meaning of life. How then can we yet speak of death?" Now to the teachings themselves. To understand the message of Confucius, we have to understand the problem which he faced. In a phrase, this was the problem of social anarchy. Confucius lived in those turbulent centuries from about the 7th to the 3rd centuries BC, which Toynbee has called the time of troubles. China was divided during these centuries into a number of warring states. Raid and counter-raid were the order of the day. It was a time when a man, when he planted a field of rice, could never be sure that he would reap it for himself, rather than some robber baron coming in to take the proceeds for him and his men. During this time, the burning question which faced every leader of society was one: how can we learn to live together without destroying one another? What is the glue which holds society together? What is the glue that holds society together? Let's think about that question for a moment, just wholly apart from Confucius. What holds society together? Well, on the animal level, the answer is instinct. Look at a colony of ants. Look at a hive of bees. Fantastic organization, fabulous cooperation, and yet they don't have to work for it. This cooperative behavior is built into their very structure through instinct. When man emerges, however, and we come to the human level, we can no longer rely on instinct to keep us working together. Rather, man has no instincts, virtually none, the psychologists will tell us. What then takes over to order society? And the answer is that in primitive society, what takes over is tradition. Now, tradition has decayed so far in our own society that it's difficult for us to imagine the power which it has in ordering the social life of early peoples. And yet, we have evidence of the power. Anthropologists tell us that there are some primitive tribes, I believe the Eskimos, some of the Eskimo tribes enter here, and some of the Australian. Some of the tribes where there is not even a word for disobedience. Some of you parents ponder that for a moment, where the cake of custom is so rigid and so powerfully channels the lives of people that they never deviate really substantially from their expectations. In our own life, there is, I think, only one area where we can see the power of tradition, and that is the area of dress. I'm wearing a tie tonight. I didn't debate as to whether I should wear a tie or not. I automatically did it. Why? Because my producer wouldn't let me appear if I didn't? Because I would be indecently exposed if I didn't have this piece of cloth around my neck? Not at all. The reason I did it was because all television professors wear ties. This is expected. And if I came with an open collar, why, some of you might think that I was strange, queer, peculiar, bohemian maybe. And you see, this I can't stand. I can't stand to be regarded as peculiar. This is the way we behave in terms of our dress, so we don't give a great deal of attention. We simply follow the expectations. My wife gives me to understand that to a woman who has the sense that she is wearing exactly the right thing for the occasion, there comes a peace which religion can neither give nor take away. Well, we can see then the power of tradition, of custom, of convention in ordering this aspect of our lives. Now, imagine a society in which everything was ordered by this kind of expectation, and we see the power of tradition. Now, in the early stages, this tradition is very spontaneous. People don't reflect about it. But there comes a time in society when spontaneous tradition begins to go to pieces as the ordering way of all one's total life. And the fact that other people expect it of you, the fact that other people are behaving this way, is no longer sanction enough. When that time comes and society faces the collapse of spontaneous tradition, what is going to take over in place of this as the ordering device for human behavior? Well, what would you say? See, this was the problem that Confucius faced, basically, the collapse of spontaneous tradition. Some people would say, well, we turn to force. We have policemen who force people to behave, but it's doubtful that force can reach close enough into the intimacies of human relation to be alone adequate to order society. Other people say reason, but again, there's a problem here as to whether reason is adequate, particularly in the early stages of the human venture of civilization that we're talking about now, 500, 600 years BC. I heard a parent say once that the most difficult age to deal with children is when they are too old to spank and too young to reason with. Well, this perhaps is not a bad picture of the condition of society that Confucius reached. I don't mean to imply that reason alone is enough to order even our own society today, but certainly at this early time, reason alone was inadequate. Force, then, and reason are inadequate answers. What is the adequate answer? And Confucius' answer, in a nutshell, was this: when spontaneous tradition breaks down as the socializing agency for human culture, then we must replace it by deliberate tradition. Now, in a nutshell, what that means is this: we must search out those values which we want to saturate all society. And then we emphasize these values through the educational process, so that the children who are growing up and right through their young manhood and right through all life, for that matter, have held before them those values which society appreciates and esteems and will honor. And this way we perpetuate an enveloping tradition, a power of suggestion which the individual citizens of a society will internalize, will make their own, and this will help them to behave in social ways. Now, what was the content of this deliberate tradition which Confucius wanted to perpetuate? I think it can be summarized in these 5 key Confucian terms. And let's look for a moment at each of them. Zhen refers to the basic quality which should pervade all human relations. What is that quality? Well, perhaps the best translation is goodness with a capital G. It is goodness in an extremely broad and general and exalted sense. It implies qualities of unselfishness, of generosity, the capacity to measure the feelings of other people by one's own feelings. The man of Zhen will be courteous in all private relationships. He will be diligent in all public relationships. He will be loyal in whatever relationship he finds himself in. This, then, is goodness in a sublimely exalted sense. Confucius thought so highly of this term that, and this I think is a very Confucian phrase, he said, one cannot speak of it without being chary. In other words, one's not glib, one's not flip about a term as exalted as this. Now, the next term is the chunzi, and this, I think, we might translate as the gentleman, if we think of the gentleman not in superficial terms of tipping of hats and pushing in of ladies' chairs, but as a true inner quality of man. Chunzi, the ideal man or the gentleman, is the completely adequate man. He is so poised that in his relationships he need not be grasping. He has the initiative towards life to such an extent that when he meets you, his attitude is not, what can I get out of you, but how can I be at your service? It is the attitude of a man who is an ideal host in his home, completely relaxed, and because he is so much at home, he can be completely at the disposal of others. The gentleman, then, is the one who carries that attitude of an ideal host with him throughout all life because he is at home in the universe. The third concept, li, this is translated usually propriety. The point here is that Confucius wanted to build up a picture in the minds of people as to how they ought to behave in virtually any situation they find themselves in. So Li, through anecdotes, through example, builds up this picture as to the ideal type of human behavior in every situation. The chief ingredients of Li center in, we don't have time to go through them all, but let me mention 2, the 5 great relationships. Confucius said the major relationships of life are 5. There is, on the one hand, the relation of the father to the son, where the father should be loving, the son should be reverential. Then the elder brother and the younger brother, where the elder brother should be gentle, the younger brother respectful. The third great relationship is between the husband and the wife, where the husband should be good to the wife, and the wife should be, well, the term really is listening to the husband. And then fourth, between elder friend and younger friend, where the elder friend should be gentle and the younger friend deferential. And finally, between the ruler and the subject, where the ruler should be benevolent and the subject should be loyal. If then these relationships are maintained, society will prosper. The second ingredient, which we must confine ourselves to this second in regard to Li, is filial piety, where Confucius felt, well, someone I heard put it in our culture. He said, when the meanings of the father no longer become meaningful to the son, civilization is in danger. This build society on this key linkage between the parents and the children. Now, all of this, then, when you take all these ways of acting, propriety, together, these form a kind of stylized ritual for all life, so that they order the life completely. And one who understands Lee understands how he should behave in every situation, every major kind of situation in human life, from the way the emperor opens the doors of the temple on the great ceremonial occasions, right down to the way you entertain the humblest guest in your home and serve him his tea. The fourth great ingredient in this pattern is te. Te means literally power. What Confucius was asking, what is the key power in governing men? There were lots of answers around during his day. Some were saying the basic power is force. You have to order society with a key police force, with a strong police force. Others said law. Confucius said no, he wasn't a pacifist. He didn't oppose law. But what he did say was that neither of these is basic. The key factor in all government, he felt, was the power. You have at the top a man who was absolutely devoted to the public welfare. This man then would gather around him a cabinet of what Hocking has called unpurchasable men, and their devotion to the general local community and down into the local citizens. When of peace, and there Confucius said that when dealing with other states, you can't rely entirely on the arts of war, on violence, force. Again, he wasn't a pacifist, but he said something else is needed, and he thought that ultimately victory would go to the side which succeeded in maintaining the highest culture, music, literature, drama, philosophy, so that the neighboring states would unconsciously admire these ways of the people who were advanced in the arts of peace. Well, did it work? That's always a difficult question. It's like asking, has Christianity worked in Western civilization? You can't say yes or no in absolute terms. But I think there are a couple of things we can say. First, if you take it quantitatively, China has achieved the greatest civilization human history has known. If you take it by the years, continuous years, which it has lasted, and the number of people it has embraced. But we're interested in more than quantitative terms. What about qualitatively? And there I think the power of success is indicated best by the admiration which Chinese culture down through its major years has elicited from even those who invaded it by force. Time and again, the barbarians would come flooding over the northwest barriers, and time and again they would find the Chinese a pushover, militarily speaking. But what happens then? Well, a typical scene is this. After the conquerors have made their conquest, 10, 15 years later, what do you find? You find the leader sitting by the side of a Chinese teacher who is also his conquered slave. And now this invader is devoting all his time to trying to write a poem which his teacher would be willing to say was not altogether unworthy of a gentleman. And already the invader is hoping to be mistaken for a Chinese. And by the time 50 years are over, the invaders are not heard of again. Here is a true melting pot. Here was a furnace of an idea which in its heyday worked on the social plane as perhaps no other civilization has worked. What about Confucianism today? Well, I'm sure we must frankly admit that this is a question that nobody has the answer to. We may be looking here at a dying religion. It is quite possible that tonight we should be echoing about Confucianism as a whole the words which Confucius applied to himself when on his deathbed his eyes gazed for the last time on the majestic dome of the sacred mountain of China, Taishan. And he is said, Confucius is said to have uttered to those about him, the sacred mountain is falling. The beam is breaking. The wise man is withering away. Maybe that is what's happening to Confucianism today. And yet, on the other hand, moral teachers do have a way of outlasting politicians and even revolutions. Gandhi will outlast Nehru, and it is more than possible that Confucius will outlast Mao Zedong. Already there are intimations that the edifice which Confucius built, which received such rough treatment in the early years under the communists, is already making some comeback. For whereas in his early book, Mao Zedong characterized Confucianism as semi-feudal, in his recent book, he advises his followers to study Confucius as well as Marx and Lenin. If then they take their leaders seriously, even the communists tonight may be pondering some words which were uttered 25 centuries ago by the greatest teacher their land has ever known. Words like these. You ask if there is one word which might serve as a cardinal precept of life. Is not altruism such a word? What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. For within the four seas, all men are brothers.
Religions of Man is produced by Washington University and KETC Channel 9, the St. Louis